After you've conducted a function-based assessment, it's time to begin designing interventions. Today, this module, we will be discussing designing functional assessment-based interventions. Intervention designs are based on the function of the target behavior with the intent of teaching the student a more efficient, reliable method of achieving his or her goal. Again, see the previous module called Function-Based Assessment module to determine the function of a behavior. An FBA must be conducted in order for you to design an effective intervention. Interventions contain three components. They contain an antecedent adjustment, reinforcement, and extinction procedures. Antecedent adjustments are things that prompt the replacement behavior and decrease the likelihood of the target behavior occurring. Reinforcement is increased rates of reinforcement for the replacement behavior, that is the appropriate behavior you want the student in doing instead. And extinction procedures include procedures to eliminate the target behavior. Although interventions must contain the three components discussed previously, there is a systematic flow chart that will guide you into which method you should use in developing an intervention. As discussed earlier in that first box on this flow chart, it says conduct a function-based assessment. We've already gone over this. See previous modules on how to do this. The second box down is select a replacement behavior. Again, we have already done this in previous modules. Now we're going to move our focus to the rest of the flow chart. Using that replacement behavior, you're going to ask yourself a key question. Can the student perform the replacement behavior? To answer this question, you're going to ask yourself, have you seen the student perform the replacement behavior? Have you seen him do this in other settings? And do functional assessment data to support your answer? You're simply going to answer this question with a yes or no, and that's going to guide you on to which side of the flow chart you're going to go. The next question is the same on both sides. The next key question says, do antecedent conditions reflect effective practice? They may be effective for the majority of the students in the class, but not necessarily for the target student. You may be asking yourself, well, what are effective antecedent conditions? Well, there's several things to consider. Several effective practices include, are there clear classroom rules and expectations? Is there consistent routine and procedures in place? Is the teacher delivering high rates of praise, full rates of praise to every one reprimand or correction? Are there multiple opportunities to respond for every student? Is the teacher using proximity? Is the teacher using instructional pacing and have with-itness for their classroom? Is the room arrangement or seating assignment, maybe that needs to be the room needs to be reconsidered, or the seating assignment might need to be reconsidered. Is the teacher securing student attention before moving on, or the student's attention before moving on? Is the teacher engaging in differential instruction? These are just some examples of effective practice. Oftentimes, when we are conducting interventions, we need to alter teacher behavior in order for students to alter their behavior. And oftentimes, these low strategies that we just talked about are extremely effective in curtailing inappropriate student behavior. There are going to be others that you can consider and add to this list of what might be considered effective practices. If your answer to conditions do represent effective practice, you're going to be led to method number 1, which is teach the replacement behavior. This is where your intervention procedures are going to focus on skill deficits. That is, the can't do or won't do. Is that a problem? Then you're going to focus on teaching that child how to engage in that replacement behavior, what you expect them to do using explicit instruction. If you have determined that the student can perform the replacement behavior and antecedent conditions represent best practice, it's going to lead you to method number 2, which is improve the environment. This is where you as the teacher need to alter the antecedent conditions, the conditions within the classroom, that set the stage for the problem behavior, that are setting the stage for the problem behavior to occur. Common antecedent adjustments can be physical room layout, such as preferential seating. Maybe that child needs to be moved closer up in the room arrangement. You may need to focus on a decompression area. If a student is starting to lose focus or starting to have a meltdown, there might be a designated area in the classroom where that child can go to decompress. You might work on some storage for your work or for the student's work. Work on an organization system for that student. Another one is visual or audio cues. The student can work on their problems on the board rather than on a piece of paper, or you can give them examples of assignments that have been completed in order for them to complete their assignment. You can add additional instructions and add in rules or expectations. You can add in a simple little hand raise that gives the student a cue that he needs to stop what he's doing and gain his attention on you. Very similarly as securing attention, you can do a simple countdown method. Eyes on me in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You've given them a prompt saying eyes on me, you've given them a countdown, and then after that countdown, the student's attention might be secure so long as you've taught them that signal. You can flip on and off the lights. You might clap. Giving these simple little signals can get all students' attention more effectively. Once you have their attention, you can move on with the lesson. Another antecedent adjustment can be self-monitoring checklists. You might have a student check mark that they've done specific steps in the assignment before moving on. It's kind of like a task analysis, or they can be monitoring if they're focused on the lesson or not. You're going to want to focus or check in on these self-monitoring checklists and then begin fading procedures once they become successful. That is, you don't want the student to be on a self-monitoring checklist forever. You want to start fading that process away. The next method that we'll talk about is method 1 and 2, and this is where you're going to both improve the environment and teach the replacement behavior. So you're going to teach the student the replacement behavior using explicit instruction, specifically telling them what you expect on them, having them practice it, and you might also need to you will also alter the antecedent conditions that set the stage for the problem behavior. Again, we just talked about what those were in previous slides. Method 3 is called adjustment of contingencies, and this is where you're going to provide functionally equivalent consequences for the replacement behavior. That is, you need to make the performance of the replacement behavior more efficient and effective than performance of the target behavior. This is going to consider the function of the behavior, use behavior-specific praise for the replacement behavior, and ignore the inappropriate behavior. You might want to provide choice on how they gain reinforcement, whether it's public praise or private praise, or if they've engaged the replacement behavior for a specific period of time. Maybe they are removed from an activity for a certain period of time, so long as escaping a task is one of their functions. Remember, reinforcement must be contingent upon performing replacement behavior. After you've gone through the flow chart and you have been instructed as to which method you need to focus on, it's time to begin the development of the intervention. Common components include extinguishing the behavior. That is, it must be based on function. You must withhold reinforcement, that is, attention or escape from the work, when the target behavior is performed. If the student engages in this target behavior, you don't want to provide attention. And if you have to provide attention, you need to provide a brief verbal prompt and then ignore. Let's say the student is engaging in off-task behavior, and prior you've always given them attention and redirected them, given them a lot more attention. Now if they're engaging in off-task behavior, you need to give a quick verbal prompt and then ignore it. And then another thing that you can do is you can remove the student from the classroom or remove the class from that student as well. That's a very last resort, and that's only on an as-needed basis. So when you're doing an intervention development, you're going to go through a specific process. You're going to conduct the FBA on the target behavior, see the previous FBA module, select a replacement appropriate behavior. Using replacement behavior, go through the flowchart that I just went through to identify the intervention method. Then finally, you're going to design the intervention with emphasis put on the method selection. Again, even though all interventions should include all components, antecedent adjustment, reinforcement of replacement behavior, as well as extinction of target behavior, your emphasis on which method, method 1, method 2, or method 3, or both, needs to be focused on that. If, say, for example, antecedent conditions do not reflect effective practice and you leave to that method, your focus of your intervention is going to focus on that antecedent adjustment. For example, after you've designed the intervention, it's time to train the teacher and the student. When you train the teacher and the student, you must train the teacher to implement, and you also must train the student to as the recipient of the intervention. You're going to teach them after the baseline, and you're going to measure the student's behavior after the function-based assessment, but before the intervention is in place. This is baseline. You want to measure that student's behavior before any intervention is implemented because it's going to give you a measure and tell you if the intervention is working or not. Again, this is just it's a little dipstick. You want to measure the behavior first with about 3 to 5 observations to get a baseline on where that student is, then design and implement the intervention. So baseline, as I said, is used to test the effects of the intervention and to measure the student's growth or lack thereof. To give you a visual, here would be an example of what it might look like as an intervention to focus on engagement for a student. In the first 5 data points, you'll see that's baseline. So again, this is pre-intervention. Here I've measured the student 5 times. I see that his engagement is low. I have then implemented the intervention on session number 6, and I see an immediate jump in data. And over time, I also see that the data is growing. Here, I can tell that my intervention is working. The student has engaged in more engagement as the intervention has continued when compared to baseline. Without baseline data, we would have no idea on if the student's engagement is actually increasing.